All right. Questions as we get started today?
A little P question here.
OP question. I'll do my best.
As future pastors,
Yes.
how do we manage that tithing thing?
How do you manage that tithing
Because
thing?
we're already giving our service to the church.
Oh, yeah, you're already giving your, just keep on reminding me of that.
Yeah. Who cares?
Yeah. Well, how much money does God want from you anyway?
None.
None.
At least so if you give enough time, you don't have to do the talents or treasures, right?
Yeah, right.
I would say it's an issue of complete
60
balance.
hours a week and don't give any money.
It's balance within your life would be the appropriate thing here. So I would say the pastor always sets the standard. So
Sorry?
I would say the pastor always sets the standard. So I would say the tithe is absolutely expected. So regardless how much you're working, I mean, you're still getting paid for it. So, and handsomely, I might add. Yes.
What would be the pros and cons about being completely transparent with the amount that you tithe to your congregation?
Well, we didn't talk about that, but that's another topic that's also of some interest. We do. I think I mentioned that in Systems 3 sometimes. So far as giving records, who knows? Somebody's going to know because they're keeping track of the numbers and writing stuff down, and because you get your statement at the end of the year, so somebody knows. I don't think you need to be. You don't need to tell them numbers. You don't need to announce because people want to figure it out, they can find out. But I think it can be generally known that you take tithing seriously, and you would do that, and you 10% what that means. For you to stand in the pulpit and say, "This is what I do." I think that's part of what St. Paul does. He says, "Be like me, imitate me," and that means imitate how I live, imitate what I speak, imitate the things I do. And so the pastor is to be the guy in the congregation where the kind of people can look at and say, that's what it looks like to follow Christ. And so that's part of your witness. It's part of who you are. And so I don't think, you don't need to be all secretive about it, but neither do you need to be upfront and say, hey, I tithe, I'm Joe Tither, that's what I do. You don't need to make it part of your identity necessarily, but it's not something you're discreet about or hiding. It's just who you are. And you're kind of upfront about that. And you just take it for granted, like this is just the way it is. And so it's just sort of like, and I do other things, just the way it is. That's how we do things in the church. That's how we do things as Christians. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was just wondering what would be the good.
Yeah, no, I don't see really anything bad in it. If people get like, ooh, he's tooting his own horn. Well, no, he's not. He's living the Christian life. But see, now, honestly, you're going to always get that kind of pushback from people. When you start living piously, you can't expect everybody to say, oh, that's so awesome, he's so great. Some people will give you that. Other people are going to be like, who does he think he is? Because there's always the desire to drag the person down. And this is just fundamental democracy. Plato talked this way. In a democracy, the head of, it's like the head of the grain of, the field of grain. And the one head that's above all the rest, what do? Lop it off. So it's the same as the rest, the leveling. So it's far easier to drag somebody down than to actually get up to his level. So when you got somebody in the congregation who's actually living a Christian life, everybody else wants them to fail so that, hey, see, I'm not so bad either. And this is why Christians just love it when a Christian falls flat. Because, oh, look, big star. He's not so cool. See, he's not so perfect. See, and now that gives everybody else their excuse to be mediocre. That's the way it goes. So when you set out the standard to say, here's how I'm going to live and here's what I'm going to do, it's going to challenge the people. And then, of course, then you set yourself up for satanic attack. That's a whole other topic that's very P. That's 2P. But you need to take seriously what it's going to mean to set out an example. But I strongly encourage you guys to do that. And you guys should be able to stand in the pulpit and stand in the congregation and say, this is what it looks like to follow Christ. This is how you love your wife. This is how you raise your kids. And you should be able to do that, guys. And I know that gets to be like, really, whoa, that's kind of like personal. My wife doesn't have anything to do with that. Get on board with this, guys. Start talking about it. Fishbowl, well, duh. Come on. And acting like it's an infringement. Oh, we're living our life in a fishbowl. Duh, of course. Yeah, you're the pastor. Everybody looks at you. You're the example. It's the way it is. Don't like it? Don't do it. Come on. I cannot believe when pastors actually have the audacity to say, I'm not living in a fishbowl. You are too, you idiot. Come on. Come clean. Deal with it. Live up to it. And if you're not ready to live up to it, don't do it. That's what it comes down to. So the whole thing on who am I? What's it look like? That's how it is. And not everybody's going to be thrilled by that. They love to see you fail, so yeah, it's all good. For a while there, I thought I might have to actually change my life a little bit. Now it's okay. I can just stay the way I am. Thanks very much. This is human nature. This is the way it is. The church is not immune from this kind of stuff. So, now the other side that I was going to mention too is there are some pastors I know who have this notion that I don't want to know what anybody in my congregation gives because that's not my business. And I would say that's absolutely your business. Absolutely your business. And I've never been able to figure out pastors who don't want to know what their people's giving record is because it'll color how I look at them. You already know who the people in your congregation are who have money. You just look in the parking lot and you can figure it out. It's not like, oh, I didn't realize he had that much money. I didn't know he was, but when you see what people are giving, you get much better clued into what's actually going on in their life. And what's really important to be able to see is when somebody stops giving or starts giving less, you say, what's going on? What people do with their giving is a huge indicator of spiritual health. And as a pastor, you should know that. At least that's my thought on that. And you might have other pastors who have strong opinions the other direction, but I think it's indefensible, frankly. That's part of their spiritual life. Their giving record, what they do with their money. Is that part of your Christian walk? Come on. Of course it is.
Was that Systems 3 where you were talking about putting them all on the wall? Was that you?
Yeah. See, I did cover Systems 3. Yeah, my dad's congregation, when we first got there, back in the 70s, at the end of the year, somewhere in December, they would actually post everybody's giving in the congregation, what they've given year to date. And they posted it right on the wall, It's like, I thought, wow. My dad, that's not so good, so we knocked it off. And in retrospect, I'm thinking, yeah, it's not a pretty good motivator. The law does its work. You got the Smiths looking at what the Jones are doing. Oh man, we're looking bad here. Kicking that big end of the year offering. There, now we're back where we need to be. It's all good. Yeah, it's human nature. It's human nature. All right, good. Anything else? All righty. So today, new topic. Today we're going to talk about the church and the state. We're going to talk about the left-hand realm. And this is an area that is just enormous and huge and fat with all kinds of implications. In fact, this is one of these topics that I teach an entire course on. And in that entire course, we don't even cover the waterfront. There's so much more. I do a 400-level course and an 800-level course, and they're totally different. There's that much stuff to cover on this topic. It's enormous and huge. And we teach it around here, well, minimally, which is one of the tragedies because you have all these more important things to be learning about. So anyway, today we're going to try to hit this and talk about it. So I had you read a couple of interesting things, I think. Had you read an essay that I ran across in working on a book that Fortress is going to be coming out with in the spring on the two realms by Farrell and Preuss and Pelican from 1953. And so that one I had you read. And then I had you look at the CTCR document from 2004, and that's kind of the classic treatment of the topic from the Synods perspective. So those are the two things I had you read. Any quick thoughts about anything there in either one of those? Just observations or comments? Yes, Nicholas?
I wondered when in the essay of Farrell and Price and so on, they used the word state in places where I more expect kind of society.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if we often have some confusion of state and which means state, which means society.
Well, that's definitely part of this whole discussion. And we make a big category mistake when we limit the idea of the two realms to simply church and state. And that's a huge loss to the depth of what's going on here. I think they're most interested in this one essay and zeroing in on pretty much the church-state interaction. And they're not really trying to do the wider thing here. But I don't think they're unaware of it, especially when they talk in the beginning about the whole idea of, kind of being put into the creation and the whole relationship as being much broader. So I think they know what's more, but they are really zeroing in on that one narrower aspect. But you're quite right. The whole discussion on the two realms needs to be situated quite widely to really benefit from it the way we need to. All right, good? All right, fine. You guys got nothing? Whatever. Everybody's afraid. It might get recorded or something. All right, so here's what we're going to do. we're gonna walk through this distinction of the two realms, and I'm going to try to give you what I would say is the Lutheran Orthodox position, which I would argue is a defensively Christian position across the board, and it's the most consistent with the scriptural witness and with the church's teaching through history. Now, this is not the only way to slice this thing or the only way to look at it. That's what makes this whole thing so complicated. Christians have a variety of ways of thinking about the interaction of what's going on, and there's different approaches. And so I'm going to try to give you the one narrow view that I would say is the Lutheran understanding, which is what you guys are all being educated into, so you should be more familiar than what's the one that matters. But traditionally, we can go back to a guy named Richard Niebuhr, Richard Niebuhr, who in the 50s, 60s, in the mid-20th century, wrote a book called Christ and Culture, which has been considered kind of the definitive treatment on how churches try to figure out, or how Christians try to sort out, what does it mean when Christ says, be in the world but not of the world? What's it mean when Christ says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and God's what is God's? How does that really translate? How does that work out? Because frankly, if you think that Jesus' words, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's, settles anything, you're not thinking very much about it. Because that verse settles nothing, right? I mean, it shut the Sadducees up, and the Pharisees and the Herodians who were coming and hassling Jesus, they were like dumbfounded by the brilliance of his move on evading their trap. But what does it really answer? So what belongs to God in the world?
Everything.
Yeah, okay, right. And if you're looking at money, whose image is on the money? It's Caesar's, so whose money is it? What's Caesar's? So whose money is it? Caesar's or God's? Yeah, see, we've gotten nowhere. So you can make the case for both directions. It really settles nothing. So we're still left with all this kind of ambiguity. And so Christians through history have been trying to sort this out. So Niebuhr says there's 5 main categories, and I'll tick them off very quickly. So the classic one, he has 2 extremes, the 2 poles on the opposite ends. On the one pole, you have Christ against culture. And so the Christ against culture model is the ones who would say that the world is inherently evil. It's based on power, and it's based on the sword. The sword is violent. Christ rejects the sword. Therefore, all Christians must follow Christ and reject the sword. And the government is considered an evil place. And we should avoid it and not be involved in it at all. So you do not hold public office. You do not vote. You do not say the Pledge of Allegiance to the American flag. That would be Christ against culture in its most radical form. So who represents this? The Amish fit into that, Mennonites fit into this, Jehovah's Witnesses do, even though they're not Christian, and so we can do a few others that kind of fit into that category, okay? So now on the other far extreme, we have Christ of culture. So, and by culture, what Niebuhr means is basically the world all around you. And so Christ against culture, and by Christ, what he really means is the church, those who follow Christ. So these are our 2 extremes. So Christ of culture is where you have the idea that God is at work in the powers and structures of this world. And so when something is happening in the structures of the world, in the government, this is actually God working. So in the civil rights movement in the 1950s, and how this changed racism and how it changed things, this was actually God working through LBJ and through the Great Society and changing the world for better. And it was the gospel that was being brought to people. So in other words, when the government's doing stuff, that's really God doing stuff. And the difference between the church and the government and the gospel and social justice all just kind of gets run together. This is Christ of culture, and everything all just gets along, and it's one big happy mess. Okay? So who represents this? Yeah, you get your far, like Unitarians, and even a lot of your mainline churches nowadays kind of are in this category. You know, what God is doing today and what he's accomplishing in the world through the civil rights movement, you know, Oprah kinds of things. And this is the you know, we're just going to invest ourselves in this world and make the world a better place. Nicholas.
Is that what social gospel?
Yes, social gospel fits into this. Rauschenbusch would be part of this kind of world as well, yes. All right. Now then, what Niebuhr does is he just starts stepping in from these and he pulls in one notch. So from Christ against culture, we come to Christ and culture in paradox. And so in this model, you have the idea that God is at work in the kingdoms of the world, and God is at work in the kingdom of the church, and there is a tension between them, and in fact a paradox between them, where we have one has the sword and one has no sword, and yet both of them are accomplishing God's purposes, and they kind of butt up against each other often, but they can also kind of cooperate, and there's this ongoing conflict between them. So that's Christ and culture and paradox. So who's that? That's us. Okay, that's the Lutheran position. All right, then we step in from here one step, and we get Christ above culture. And Christ above culture model is the idea that the church really is the final show in town, and it is really the normative thing, and God is at work in the power structures of the church, and every government and every institution of the world and every king and every emperor is really under his authority, whether they know it or not, and the church is the final show. So who's this? This is Rome. This is the classic Roman Catholic position, that we really are, the church is the thing, and everything else is underneath it. And sometimes people are aware of that, like in the Middle Ages. Now they're not so much aware of it, but we still know it. And there's this kind of self-confident, almost arrogance of we're just kind of above everything. And then this also translates into the sense that everything in the world is really ours anyway, and we're not really too concerned about it. So they don't have this kind of antipathy, worldly things. That's not a big concern. And you think about even your typical Catholic layperson, how this attitude translates down, how it trickles down. Most of your Catholic people don't get too worked up about worldly movies or worldly plays or casinos. That's just all part of the world, and it's all part of God's creation. It's all cool. Just do it fine. That's kind of the attitude. Whereas you think about your typical kind of Baptist, who maybe is more of the leaning this Christ against culture, everything out there in the world is scary and dangerous, and be careful, and it's all bad, and look out. And you kind of just see how the attitude starts to shift even down into lower things. And that's part of what's going on here, okay? Then the middle one is Christ transforming culture. And this is Niebuhr's last one, so of course it would be his favorite. Save the best for last. But in the Christ transforming model, we have the idea that the world is a broken place, but the church is transforming it and changing it and bringing it in line with God's purposes. And so then the goal is to bring the world into God's conformity now. Now, not waiting for the eschaton. It's happening now. We're making the world a better place all the time, and we're transforming it. So who fits this bill? Evangelicals are here, okay? And this was really strong in the post-millennial kind of move. Back when, we're making the world a better place. And that was kind of Christ of culture there too. But it's the idea of trying to inject God into things and making the world better. Here's part of how the difference would work. The transformists would say the goal is a Christian America, okay? A Christ and culture and paradox would say the goal is not a Christian America. The goal is just a more just America. So that's part of where you see the difference is starting to come down here between these. So these are your classics. And these have been vilified and attacked, and they have shortcomings, but these are very helpful categories just in being able to think about why is there so much latitude in how Christians approach this? And why do Christians see this so differently? And when you see it this way, it starts to make a lot more sense. You can say, I can see where these people are coming from. And again, the guy who did this is H. Richard Niebuhr, and his book is Christ and Culture. So if you're curious, you can check that out and go further. And that book is still in print because it's been reprinted and gets used and studied. And when you read it, it's actually pretty well written. Niebuhr was no slouch. He's a good scholar, and he's pretty balanced in his presentation of most of the stuff on here. So what we're going to zero in on is this, and think more about how this plays out and what's actually going on if we're going to consider what's being taught here. And frankly, when Niebuhr actually talks about these, he goes here, and then here, and then here, and he does the paradox and transforming the last two, and he's pretty sympathetic to a lot in the paradox. He sees a lot of the strength there, but ultimately he wants the world becoming a better place now and isn't content to just live in the paradox or live in the tension. Now, having said all this, I don't even like the term paradox very much. That's Niebuhr's term, but I find the word paradox kind of frustrating because paradox implies things that really don't belong together and just get shoved together. But in fact, if we understand these two realms correctly, it fits together quite nicely. Now, the other thing we're talking about here is, just to set the stage, we're talking about what's often called the doctrine of the two kingdoms. And this terminology gets used, and a lot of Lutherans hear this and think, oh yeah, we're talking about the doctrine of the two kingdoms. We're talking about the left hand and the right hand. That's what's going on here. Yeah, I know all about that. That's a separation of church and state. Got it. No, you don't. Okay? No, you don't. In fact, this term doctrine of the two kingdoms never shows up in Luther anywhere. He doesn't call it this. It's not a doctrine for him any more than the doctrine of the two kinds of righteousness. It's a paradigm he uses all over the place, and it shoots through everything he does, but it's never laid out as one of the loci or one of a locus in Christian theology. It's just not. It's just part of how he operates. It's there underneath everything. The other thing we have to be careful of is when we start talking about the two kingdoms teaching in Luther, the two kingdoms doctrine, is we have to be really cautious because Luther uses his terminology quite variously. And there are times when he would say two kingdoms. And what he means is kingdom of heaven, kingdom of earth. And what he can mean by that then is God's kingdom and man's fallen kingdom. Or sometimes he'll talk about the kingdom of God and the kingdom of Satan. And there you have kind of a black and white. God's kingdom, Satan's kingdom. Kingdom of grace, kingdom of sin. Very different contrast here. And in fact, some of you are familiar with Gustav Wingren's Lutheran Vocation, usually assigned reading in Systems 3. And in Lutheran Vocation, Wingren uses this terminology in the God-Satan kind of distinction. And so that's what he's following, and Luther talks this way. Then other times, though, Luther will talk about, all right, there are these two kingdoms. There's the temporal, and then there's the spiritual. Now, he means something very different. But if we're going to try to just make Luther fit into all of our neat little pieces, we'll take the same idea of God, Satan, and try to map it onto temporal, spiritual, and we come up with, well, spiritual is God's and temporal is Satan's, and so therefore temporal is evil. And that's a big problem. So that's why we don't want to do that. And so for terminology's sake in English, what I have tried to do, and this is something Kolb taught me, he says the continental theologians are trying to do this, is I'll reserve kingdoms for God, Satan. But when I'm talking about the idea of a temporal and a spiritual, well, then I'll use the term realms. And realm, again, is a funny translation, but you can go with spheres or area of responsibility. You can pick your terminology, but we're going with an area of influence, a space, a realm. And realm gets the idea of a area of ruling. That's kind of what we're looking for here, okay? So, now what I want to do is lay out the two realms for you and try to make some sense and be somewhat reasonable for you. All right, any questions at this stage? All good? All right.
I do have a question.
Okay, fire away question.
So of the many different two kingdoms, would two realms be one of them, or is that a bad way to think about it?
I think that's not a good way to think about it. I would just say, terminology is terminology with Luther. You just need to make sure you know what he's doing and how you're using your terminology. Are you using the way he did or a different way, and just kind of track with it. It's arbitrary to say I'm not going to use kingdoms anymore for temporal spiritual. That's kind of arbitrary, but it's just a matter of trying to be consistent with your own usage and try to, whatever you're going to use, just be consistent with it. And if you prefer to use kingdoms for it, make clear what you mean by this and make clear you're not talking about the God-Satan distinction here. All right, okay? So it works this way, guys. Oh, and a quick word, too, on this. We may as well do this right off the bat. Often this gets talked about left-right. And in doing the research for my book that's it's forthcoming from Fortress, okay? Just do my little advertisement. Holy Citizens due out in this next spring, second quarter, something like that. So anyway, you can watch for that. So anyway, in doing that research, I was using left-right all the time, writing my book. And then I started paying attention and realizing Luther wasn't using that terminology. In fact, Luther has some pretty significant essays on this topic. In the 1520s, he wrote one called Temporal Authority, to what extent it should be obeyed. Then he wrote one on can soldiers be saved? And these are both from the 1520s. And in both of those long essays, he never once uses the phrase left and right. Never. Doesn't use it. And so then there's a couple essays he does where he's doing commentaries on the Psalms, Psalm 82 and in Psalm 110. And in those longer commentaries, never use the terminology left-right. In fact, in the whole Luther corpus, it's just a handful of instances where he uses left-right. And it's usually just one time in passing along the way to do something else. He doesn't ever use it as an extended terminology. As much as it might be helpful, it's just not there. So I've been trying to get in the habit of just being a little more fair to Luther. Well, I think left-right is still useful and conveys something. To say it's Luther's distinction is a little bit disingenuous. I get the sense from being Luther, it was probably floating around in the air already in his time. He just kind of picked up on it a little bit, but he never actually developed it fully or used it a lot. It just wasn't one of his favorite terminologies. So here's what we're doing then. So God, of course, is the one who is the control of everything. And what we're recognizing then is God is at work in this world in two very distinct ways. And we have to be careful not to think somehow the two realms is just one more way of talking about two kinds of righteousness and law gospel. It's all just the same thing. No, it's not. No, it's not. Law gospel is answering the question, how does God speak? Two kinds of righteousness is asking the question, how does the creature live in this world? He lives before God, he lives before his fellow creatures. And the two realms is asking the question, how does God work in the world? How does God work in the world? So you're answering different questions with these different distinctions. And it's helpful to keep the distinctions straight and know what you're doing in each of them instead of trying to conflate them into one big mess. And it does become a mess. James?
Can you go over those three?
Yeah, law gospel is answering the question, how does God speak to a person? How does God speak? He speaks a word of law, he speaks a word of gospel. And then the two kinds of righteousness is asking the question, how does the creature live in this world? He lives coram Deo, he lives coram mundo. Two relationships, okay? And then the two realms is answering the question, how does God work in this world? And he works according to the temporal realm and according to the spiritual realm. All right, so that's where we're going to go now. So we have then two distinct realms, two distinct areas where God is going to be at work. And we can call these roughly the left and the right, okay? So we have these two distinct realms, the left and the right, and we use those terms somewhat loosely because they are helpful, but we recognize Luther's not using this terminology a lot, even though it shows up once in a while. So the left and the right. The reason the left and the right is so helpful is because it reminds us that these are both God's hands. It's God's right hand and God's left hand. So it's not like one belongs to God and one belongs to Satan. That's why I'm being so careful about the two kingdoms not being God, Satan, because we cannot put God, Satan up here or we're in trouble. That is going to throw everything off whack. All right, so the two realms. What we're going to call these then is the temporal realm. And again, that even seems kind of somewhat problematic. And the other one is the spiritual realm. And even this terminology is not my favorite because spiritual now somehow implies, spiritual and interior, and temporal, that's just merely material stuff. And that's not really getting the idea. Don't run this into a Gnostic idea. Just think about this. Really what we're talking about here is this one's mostly interested in coram mundo stuff. And this one's mostly interested in coram Deo stuff. But as we're going to see, it's not an exclusive thing. All right? It's just the areas of primary responsibility. That's what's kind of going on here. All right. Now, in the temporal realm, which is interested in things in this horizontal world, the law is the central thing. It's really all about the law. Because the law is what? Yes, Formula of Concord, Article 6, Paragraph 6. The law is the will of God for His creation. And when you have that definition for law, everything starts to change in your mind. It's not negative, it's not horrible, it's not something to be avoided or rejected. The law is the will of God, it's a good thing. So the law runs the show in the temporal realm, God's law. And what law are we talking about here? Yeah, the whole idea here is simply the natural law, the built-inness. And that's how to think about natural law. It's the idea of the sort of built-in reality of how things just are in the world. That's the law we're talking about. We're not talking about some arbitrary list made up on Mount Sinai. The Ten Commandments is nothing more than an expression of God's built-in desires for how the world is supposed to work. So when you ask the question, how are things supposed to be working in this world? God's law speaks to this. That's the natural law. That's the norm. That's why the law runs the show in the temporal realm. Making sense? Now, in the right hand, spiritual realm, what's the central thing? Gospel, of course. So the gospel is central. And all the way down here on my two columns, I'm going to try to set up some nice balance. And it gets a little bit stretching sometimes, but I'm doing my best. All right. So in the temporal realm then, what we're thinking about primarily is relationships with creatures. So it's all interested in relationship with fellow creatures. And in the right, what are we really interested in? Relationship with? All right, with the Creator, with God. So that's the difference. So in the temporal, it's all about creatures. In the spiritual, it's all about the Creator. That makes good sense. In the temporal realm, we have an institution who's responsible for the oversight of this realm. That institution is The government. So the government is the responsible institution that God uses. In the spiritual realm, what's the institution God uses? The church. All right. So the church is the institution over here. And they should start making pretty good sense. You see how this all starts to shake out. So the government is God's chosen means. And this is exactly what we see Paul saying in Romans 13 and Peter saying in 1 Peter 3. Right? The government is there by God's will. And God is using this. And this is why Cyrus in the Old Testament can be called the Messiah of God, even though he's a pagan. Because Cyrus is doing God's bidding and is accomplishing God's purpose. And even Babylon can be considered the arm of God and the tool of God when it comes and wipes out Israel, or Judah, as the case may be. What's good with that? Well, it's because, you see, in the temporal realm, the government is God's tool, God's means. All right? So, we go further. In the left, then, or in the temporal realm, we have government, and so therefore we have civil servants. And these civil servants carry out this work, whether they're elected or appointed or hired, policemen, soldiers, politicians, government workers, civil servants, bureaucrats, tons of those. What do we have, though, in the right hand? What do we have in the spiritual realm? We have servants of the Word. So we have servants of the Word who are not civil servants, but they are servants of Christ and of the church and servants of the Word. And of course, we're thinking primarily here of pastors. All right, good. Yeah, pastors, bishops. All right. So, yes?
Would we put other church workers in there? But
Well, if you want to, sure. Sure, if they're doing this stuff for the sake of the church. Deaconess, go ahead, throw her in there. That's good. All right. So over here, how does the civil servant make sure this stuff all happens? He's got the sword. And as Paul says, he doesn't use it for nothing. And in the spiritual, what do we have? We don't have a sword. We have nothing more than the Word. The Word is there. So over here, we're very much interested in ethics, in behavior, in how people operate, in the morality that drives people. So ethics is a very driving concern. Over here, we're not so much interested in ethics, but we're more interested in the means of grace. Because the means of grace deliver the gospel. And the things we're really zeroed in on and really concerned about are the gospel kinds of stuff. Because that's the central thing over here, is the gospel. And so the law is all about ethics. Gospel is all about means of grace. So those tie together very nicely. So the goal in the left is to preserve and protect. They try to keep a lid on things. They keep things from falling apart. Quell sin. Rein in bad behavior. And they're trying to preserve things and protect things. The goal here is not to save the world. Even though a lot of governments get eschatological pretensions of trying to redeem everything and create a perfect utopian world, and Clinton's going to bring us to a new promised land, and Trump's going to make everything all better. No, it's not going to do that. It's just basically keeping the lid on it, keep the wheels from falling off. That's what governments are for. However, in the church, what's our goal? We're not just there to preserve and protect the creation. Our goal is very broad, is to redeem and restore the whole creation. That's what we're interested in. So it's not enough just to preserve and protect. The temporal realm is aiming at justice. The goal is always justice, because justice is the will of God in action. That's what justice is. In the right hand, what are we aiming at? Justification. Yeah, get your parallelism here. It's all corny, but it works. So it's not just justice, it's justification before God. AC4 stuff. All right, so the goal in the temporal realm is the right functioning of creation. So when creation is working the way it's supposed to, that's good. And we're content with that. And in the left, or in the right hand, in the spiritual realm, we're not aiming at the right functioning, we're aiming at the full restoration of creation. Everything back completely the way it's supposed to be. Not just everything's okay, things are cruising along. We want the full restoration of everything. I know I'm getting a little low down here. I'm almost done. All right. Finally, then, we would say the temporal realm is always working toward peace, because it's always somewhat elusive, because we are sinful people and corrupt people, and power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and so it's always a process toward peace, sort of like Middle East. Will there ever be peace in the Middle East? Probably not. It's just kind of a harbinger of how everything is. So it's just not going to happen. But here we have peace right now. And we have that peace right now through the means of grace and through our right relationship with God and with one another, we can live in that peace fully right here in God's grace. Now, ultimately, if I had more room at the bottom, or this is a higher board, what we're going to do is we're going to take the two realms and we're going to pull them together, and where they come together is Christ's eschatological kingdom. And the important thing to recognize here is that at Christ's return, when he establishes his throne and fully consummates his kingdom, this is not the wiping out or the abolition of the left-hand temporal realm. It's the fulfillment of it. It's bringing the temporal and the spiritual back together into one reality called the eternal kingdom of Christ, which will be fully manifest at his second coming. And so we have coming together then the temporal realm and the spiritual realm joining in this beautiful fulfillment of all that God has accomplished at Christ's second coming. That's where we're headed. So those are your two realms kind of side by side, thinking about what's going on. To finish this out and to give you the last part of this, there are two driving axioms that are at work whenever you're thinking about this. And the first one is, between the two realms, there should be a careful distinction without a divorce. So you do not divorce them from each other. And then the second one is, there should be a careful cooperation without confusion. So there should be cooperation between these two sides, but we don't confuse them. We don't run them into one. We keep them distinct, and yet we also don't divorce them. We don't push them apart. All right. Now, it is my contention, and I'm convinced of this more all the time, that if a person understands this, thinks this through, comes to terms with it, thinks about the axioms, a person who gets this has everything they need to know to face every situation they're going to ever face regarding church-state stuff. It's all right here. Everything you need is right here. And if you just take these things and apply them carefully and think them through and hold attention and all these things together, you'll come out with appropriate action. It's just that comprehensive, and I'm convinced of this. So a couple things come into play then right off the bat. Is what I'm putting up here the same thing as Jefferson's wall of separation? It's clearly not. Jefferson's wall of separation is not this. And so this is one of the first ahas we meet. Lutheran people do not believe in the separation of church and state the way that Jefferson laid it out, or even necessarily the way the Constitution lays it out. What we're interested in is making sure that we recognize God's activity in these two spheres and recognizing what's distinct in each of them. And so the spiritual realm is very interested in the Coram Deo stuff, and this one's very interested in the Coram Mundo stuff, but they're not doing the same thing, and yet they're not at odds with each other. And the last thing we want is for Christian people to kind of start parceling these things out into nice, neat divisions. It doesn't work that way. Frankly, what was motivating Jefferson was not his desire for the church to stay pure from the world. His desire was to keep the church out of the government, because he didn't want the church messing around with his important government stuff. Because he was far more interested as an Enlightenment son of the Enlightenment in the experiment that America was in the Rousseau-Lockean idea than he was in trying to preserve the church inviolate. He could care less about that. All he needed the church for was a little moral teaching. That's what he was interested in from the church. So you go over there in your little spiritual ghetto, do your little play stuff with your church stuff. That's great. And then just leave the big work to the big boys over here. Thank you very much. That was his attitude. And that's pretty much where we are as a country now, if you think about where things have played out and how things are operating. So that's kind of where we are. So that's one of the first observations. So we have, everything I think is up here that we need to think about this. So we have to be careful then that we don't divorce them. And that's what Jefferson had us do with this wall of separation. Neither, however, should we confuse them, where we start running them together, where you start having, this one big mess called good Christian American. And so you got God, guts, and guns made America great. And you got mom and apple pie and Thanksgiving and God and church. And it's all just running together here. And it's all so cool being American and we're all Christian. And it's just one big mess. That would be a confusion. That's a problem as well. And a lot of our evangelical friends are notorious for this kind of stuff. I still remember the big billboard I saw in Tennessee driving through one time after, shortly after the whole attacks on the trade towers, and it said, freedom, created by God, paid for by Christ, defended by veterans. And, it's just, and if you don't think that's bad, you don't get this yet. That's bad. And it's really bad. It's totally confusing. What kind of freedom are we talking about here? The freedom that Christ paid for is not the freedom that the veterans are over there shooting people for. Two different things. One's a social liberty, the other one is freedom coram deo. That's a huge confusion. And we perpetuate this confusion all the time in our churches, especially every year 4th of July weekend rolls around. And it's like, all right, let's pull out all the stops, get out the old patriotic banners and wave the American flags, and we'll get everything all set up. So we got our honor guard set. They're going to march down the center aisle, and we're all going to stand up, and we're going to pledge allegiance, or how do we do it? We're going to pledge allegiance to the American flag, and we're going to show our dedication. And then we're going to turn and face the Christian flag and stick our finger in the air and pledge allegiance to the Christian flag with a neat little trite phrase. And then we're going to sing, what's that?
Don't forget the Bible, the Baptists do the Bible.
Well, yeah, fine, JD. I never did that one.
Okay.
JD's pledges allegiance to the Bible, too. So, the Bible don't. All right.
And in Texas.
Thorough fundamentalist.
They did. They're all here now.
Thorough fundamentalist move. And so then we do that pledge, and then we all sing, let's see, what should we sing? America the Beautiful, because it's got God in it. And we're all good. And then they go traipsing out, and then we continue on with the service, and everybody just feels so good. That's junk. It's junk, junk, junk. Because what have you just said? God and America, just all one big mess. And your Christian faith and your American patriotism is all just one big thing. And I just recoil every year. I see the little ladies come up with their little pins in the shape of a cross with the American flag colors all over the cross. And the teenagers come with their cool Jesus t-shirts with their American flags and their Jesus crosses all stuck on top of each other, a fish shape with the American flag on top of it. And if you've got one of those shirts at home in your drawer, go home and burn it, okay? Get rid of it. It's junk, guys. It's totally confusing, all this. It's causing a mess. It's not helpful. It's confusing which is which. Now, does that mean we can never talk about the state in the church? Of course not. We're not Anabaptists. So do we pray for our state in the church? All the time. Should we pray for our leaders by name? Yes. Can we thank our veterans on Veterans Day and stand up and have them acknowledge them in the service and even pray and thanking God for them? Can we do that? Of course. We're thanking people for doing their vocations. That's all cool. So there's plenty of room to be appreciative of the left hand without conflating these and causing all kinds of strange confusions. All right. So this is the basic paradigm. And I would contend that this thinking brings a lot of clarity to a lot of things. But now this is where all the fun starts. Because now, what about all the what ifs start to pop up? And there are so many of them. They start to pop up when it comes to trying to figure out how to sort this stuff out. So the one last thought then, and then I'll see if you guys have any questions at all, if you're all still meek and cowed into submission, is the individual Christian then lives in both at once. This is the whole point. And he does not go from back and forth. Sunday morning, here I am doing my spiritual realm thing. Up Monday morning, back to work. Okay, now I'm back over here doing my left-hand stuff. No, that's totally messed up. And it's not like, okay, over here, I have to be nice and forgive people. Over here, I'm a cutthroat, and I'm just going to be a hard-nosed because that's what you got to do in the world. No, that's messed up. He's living in both at once. But he's recognizing that his responsibilities are unique in each of these realms. So he is always God's forgiven child, always thinking in terms of the gospel, always thinking in terms of the fact that he has no rights. He's not going to demand his fair share. He's not going to try to get what he can out of the world. He's there to simply serve the people around him because that's who he is in Christ. And then he goes over here and he serves people in his vocations. In fact, the whole doctrine of vocation, where does that belong? Is that a spiritual realm or a temporal realm thing? Yes. Yes, because it comes from God. But where's it lived out? It's here. It's a temporal stuff. Your vocations are all about here. That's why marriage, is marriage a spiritual realm thing or a temporal realm thing? Temporal. Coming and going. No doubt about it. And people get really bent out of shape. Now, wait a minute. God created marriage. We get to define it. That's why the world's so wrong to change the definition of marriage. You're missing the whole point. Marriage is here for the sake of the world. It's God's gift. It says God's world, but it is the temporal realm thing. It's got nothing to do with your eternal life. It's got nothing to do with your standing before God. It has everything to do with being a good creature in this world, just like doing all your other vocations. Being a good father, good husband, good policeman, good secretary, good pastor. Has nothing to do with where you stand before God. Everything to do with serving your neighbor. Getting this? See how this is starting to play out? So that's what I'm saying. The implications of this are profound and interesting. So in other words, can a Christian be a soldier? The answer is yes. He can know where he stands, coram Deo. He can know that he's not going to defend his personal rights, and yet, for the sake of his neighbor, he will take up arms and he will go to war if necessary to stop an enemy from hurting the helpless one in his country. That's appropriate. He can do that. That's his vocation. And this gets interesting because it's like, those seem contradictory, but they're not when you understand this appropriately. That's the tension that exists. That's what's going on here. But is it possible for a soldier to misuse his vocation and start to violate God's purposes? Well, of course. This is why John the Baptist tells the soldiers, what should we do? They ask. And he says, don't take more than you should. Don't extort anybody. Treat people with justice. There you go. Do your job and do it without being a jerk. Okay? So you begin to see the dynamics of this thing. It's pretty phenomenal. And it's important to recognize that this stretches to everybody. It's not just a pastor thing. This is for everybody in your congregation. All right. We'll pause here, see if there are any interesting questions or thoughts at this stage, and then we'll unpack it some more.
How do you address the people who are convinced they're fighting an unjust war?
All right. So the question is, can there be a war that's unjust? And the answer is obviously yes, absolutely. And in fact, if you look over America's history, probably most of the wars have been unjust in some way or another. And so the reality is that you as an individual Christian are responsible for your conduct. And if you believe that the government is leading you into an unjust war, you would say, sorry, I can't go. I won't go. And at that point, you become a conscientious objector, is the technical term for it. But more realistically, you just become civilly disobedient. And there's a place for that. Because civil disobedience means I can't obey what the government's telling me to do because it would violate what God's telling me to do, and I won't do that. And that's appropriate. That's what Christians have to do sometimes. But when you do that, you deal with it. You pay the price. You are free to be faithful. Maybe we'll come back to that. We'll see. All right.
How does the temporal realm play in the eschatological kingdom?
Well, the eschatological kingdom is going to be a material kingdom, isn't it?
Okay.
New heavens and a new earth. It's going to be tangible. It's going to be real. There are going to be people there. And those people are going to be living lives that are worthwhile and productive within God's new creation. What that means, we'll all wait and see. But in other words, there will be a temporal realm, or not temporal because it'll be now eternal, but it will be material and tangible and physical, not merely spiritual. That's why I'm saying I'm not crazy about even these terms because they don't communicate quite the way they should. Because spiritual here doesn't mean immaterial. Spiritually means in sync with God's purposes of the Holy Spirit. That's really what it means. This is Paul's spiritual definition, not Plato's. And most of us are trained to hear Plato here instead of Paul, frankly, even Christians. We still hear spiritual as, woo, ghost, immaterial, instead of spiritual being in sync with God. Okay?
So you kind of think about it as, well, I would think about it as the pre-fall creation where, there was real stuff going on.
Right.
I mean, people were eating, drinking.
The continuity between the creation and the recreation is really important. So we're not going back to the garden. We're not a repristination. We're moving forward into God's plan, and yet there's a continuity.
But it's solid like
That's
that.
right.
It's not
That's right.
floating into the clouds.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. That's a Systems 3 thing you should have covered and thought about C.S. Lewis and the Great Divorce and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. If you haven't read that, do. It's worth reading. All right, good. Other questions?
Can you go back and explain what you said about, most of the wars have been unjust?
Oh, yeah.
Interested.
You're interested in that.
Just
Yeah, as a vet. Yes, that's fine. There are criteria for a just war. There are 5 criteria for going into war: use in ad bellum, and there's 2 criteria for conduct of fighting within the war, which is called use in bello, or the laws in war. So the 5 going into it are: you have to have a war of defense only. There has to be a proportionate kind of a thing. In other words, you are investing enough that it's worth the investment. There has to be a reasonable expectation that you're going to win. There has to be, let's see, what's my other two? Right intention. Yeah, you got them in front of you there, JD? Okay, right intention. So you're not doing this to gain territory. You're doing this simply to assert justice. And what's the last one then? Last resort. You've exhausted all other possibilities. All right. So on those criteria, let's go with World War II. That's probably America's best war. And so on those criteria, all 5 of those are met. It was a defensive war. We weren't trying to get territory. We had tried everything. We drug our heels, went in only when we were attacked. And it seemed like we could probably win, even though that was kind of iffy, but we went into it. So then we're set there. So then about the conduct of the war. Well, that's when you run into trouble. There's 2 rules there. One is proportionality. You should be responding with in a means appropriate to what you were attacked with. And that's probably legit. Then the other one, though, is no non-combatant targets. So you can't aim at civilians. And then that gets problems when you got Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Dresden firebombing. So you're targeting civilian targets and so forth.
Yeah, I see your point. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
You'd still call it a just war even though Germany never attacked us?
Oh, Germany was in alliance with Japan, so it all ties in together. That's the way governments work. Yeah, I'd say that's fine. Yep.
What were those fancy terms, Latin terms?
Jus ad bellum and jus cum bello. No. I'll put it up here, but you don't have to know this. Yeah.
Anything on that board, we don't have to know, right?
Different class. Different class.
Left.
Yeah. All right. Okay? Good? Other questions? So, should there be an American flag in the chancel of a Lutheran church? No. Shouldn't. Why would there be?
To make people think we're not Nazi supporters?
Right. And in fact, historically, the flags only came into Lutheran chancels during the First World War and the Second World War, when people were suspicious that Germans really weren't very good Americans. So we wanted to prove that we were, so we put flags in our chancels. That's when they came in. And I mocked earlier the pledge to the Christian flag. The Christian flag was created by a YMCA employee around the turn of the century in 1900. And he made it up on some devotion. And so he just said it should be a white field, a white flag with a blue field. He just made it up. It's got no history. And then the little stupid pledge, I pledge allegiance to the Christian flag. You know, why are we pledging allegiance to a stupid flag? We are Christians. What do we have for symbols in our church? The cross? What are we on a flag for? It's absurd. We've got a crucifix, for crying out loud. And why do we have to pledge allegiance to the flag? What do we have when we want to confess our faith? The creed? Yeah, a little more depth there than a 100-year-old dumb pledge some guy made up over, donuts at breakfast. It's just so annoying. And so it's just trivial and trite. So we don't need a Christian flag. And we certainly don't want an American flag in the chancel, because the chancel is where God's doing his stuff. It's where God's giving his gifts. We don't drag patriotic stuff in there. It just doesn't belong. It just isn't the right place for this. Can you put a flag outside along the road? Sure, because is the church still an institution in the world? Yeah, it is. So it's appropriate and it's fine, but it really doesn't belong in the chancel. Now, don't go causing all kinds of big ripples the first week by dragging the flag out and say, it's got to go, But if you get bored 3 years in, go for it, And, yeah, when everything else is in place, go for that. And what I suggest is do it kind of gradually, just a little bit at a time. It's right up there by the altar, so you just kind of move it down to the corner, then down the side aisle and out, And it can stay in the narthex, that's fine. If they really want their fancy flag, you can keep it there. Somebody suggested, and this isn't mine, but somebody told me they did this. They stripped the altar on Good Friday, which is a great thing. So they stripped out everything, including the flags. And then on Easter, they just didn't come back. Huh. What happened to them? I don't know. So anyway, just some thoughts for you. All right. Yeah, I think that's pretty good too. Now, if you've got this, if this isn't sitting well with you and you're still not convinced, ask. I can make a stronger case, and I don't want you to take stuff for granted. So ask your questions here.
I'm all for not confusing the two. No problem there. My difficulty is that, especially having lived internationally, I am significantly not patriotic in comparison to many of my classmates.
Yeah, I can understand.
So I guess I really struggle when I encounter people who are very patriotic, and even to how to converse with them.
Yeah.
Because I see myself, I've just seen myself operating much more
Yeah.
without that.
Well, you have to be careful that you don't start sliding off into kind of a neo-Anabaptist, enemy country bad. And if you've traveled overseas, you should know how good you've got it here, which is one of the things I always come home thinking, man, we've got it really good here. And that's true. So is there a lot to be grateful for as an American? Yes. And can I thank God profoundly for the gifts of this country? Yes. Is this country deeply flawed? Yes. Is it really annoying? Yes. And is it, violating God's will all over the place? Of course. But man, you look at the options, and there's a lot going for it. And I'm always reminded of Churchill's famous dictum that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others we've tried. And so I think he's on the right track there. There's a lot wrong here, but there's a lot that's on the whole good. And if you're still not convinced, read some Richard Newhouse, and he'll help you appreciate a little more what we have going for us. So in other words, you don't have to become an ardent patriot, but you should have an appreciation for what God has given you in the country. Luther is a pretty good example of this. He could deride Germans up and down, but he was still proud of what God had done in his German heritage, and he knew that God was using his prince to accomplish purposes, which is a cool thing. So I get what you're saying, but just be careful you don't let it slide into kind of a world evil. It's not. It's messed up, but it's not evil. All right, good? Yeah, Nicholas.
What have we to do if the second axiom is all over the place, always in the country, that especially the structure of the country is reformed in such a way, like for example, an Islamic country, for example, when no distinction at all is made, and you will always be confronted with this confusion.
Okay, so you got constantinianism. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more when we read Hauerwas next week. So constantinianism is this kind of unholy alliance between church and state. And this is where you have the confusion. And so, yeah, you're right. It's still in a lot of places in Europe. This is still officially on the books. You got the state church and the whole thing, which is ironic because while the state's still paying for the church, nobody gives a rip about the church and nobody cares. But they still are doing their thing. So it's kind of a weird thing. That will go away eventually, too. So it's going to disappear. But Constantinianism is this kind of unholy alliance. And that's part of the confusion between church and state. Now, the tension here, though, is this. Luther, for all his clarity in teaching this, would also, though, turn around and accept help from the prince. And in fact, suggest the prince should try to stamp out heresy because it's not good for the left hand. Not good for the temporal realm. And the church, he said, can certainly accept, help from the state because if the state is smart, it wants the church to be strong and healthy because its citizens need this. So in other words, if the state was willing to say to the church, hey, we think what you're doing is really important. We want people to have a solid understanding of who they are as creatures, and we want you to have our support. We're going to actually give you some money to help with that. I would say the church could say, cool, we'll use it well. But the church also has to be careful not to become dependent upon this, which is exactly what happens in state church and what happens in our own country where we become dependent on tax-exempt status, where we're to the point now where a lot of churches, if they had to actually pay their tax load, and we're not just talking, 5-10 cents on the dollar for their Dixie cups for the youth retreat, we're talking property tax on chunks of property and on buildings which they can't even dream of paying. Okay? Think how much the property tax would be on 80 acres in Clayton for this seminary property. Just think about that one for a minute. All right? So that's where Constantinianism starts to kick in. And this is where you start having, are we becoming overly dependent? Because you see, this is a dynamic relationship between these. The government can be interested in what's going on here and support it. And Luther even said, when this institution is messed up and the church isn't doing its job, the state can step in and fix it. And he wanted princes to help getting the church straightened out, which makes a lot of people today just gasp in horror to think we're inviting the government in to fix this. But for Luther, it makes perfect sense. Just like he would say, if the government is completely dropping the ball, the church can step in and get it back on its feet. And this has actually happened historically. When you have a country collapses, and sometimes the church steps in and actually provides some order and keeps things under control until the government can reestablish itself. This is good. That's the cooperation. There's nothing wrong with that. But when they become confused and conflated, then we get trouble. So that's what I'm saying. There's tensions here. And it's interesting how it plays out. It's not lockstep, easy, throw everything into the separate boxes. It's fun because it's dynamic and interesting, and there's things to discuss and sort out because it's not neat and clean. It's kind of a lively dynamic. It's kind of fun. And by the way, then also, if the government is not doing its job in upholding justice, can the church rebuke it? Yes. In fact, it must. Luther was clear about this. He even said the pastor is responsible to call the prince to task for his failure to uphold justice. And he must, because if he doesn't, then the people will become despairing because they'll think nobody's going to hold this guy accountable. Pastor's got to do it. Fascinating. So, can we have politics in our sermons? Answer would be yes, we should. In fact, to avoid politics in your preaching is to be guilty of quietism. And quietism is a great sin. Quietism is saying, I'll be over here doing my church stuff, and over here the world can do its world stuff, and never the twain shall meet. That's quietism. And the grossest example of this is what the Deutsche Christen were doing in the 30s when Hitler's coming to power and seizing all control. And what do they say? He's God's duly appointed leader. We elected him. He's our chancellor, so it's okay. And meanwhile, he's rewriting doctrine. He's violating justice. And the church is saying, what are you going to do? Well, they were dead wrong. That's quietism at its worst. We are guilty of the same kind of stuff. Oh, we don't want to get political. Not our business. We can't tell people how to vote. That's not our business. Well, you can tell people to be moral. You can tell people to uphold justice. You can tell people that a vote for injustice is a sin. You can tell people that.
And you cross a line when you start calling out candidates.
I don't know, maybe not. I'm not even worried about that. Because you see, the whole point is constantinianism. And where constantinianism shows itself is when you have people in your congregation who say, oh, pastor, don't start talking about the homosexual stuff because we're gonna lose our tax exempt status. As soon as you start checking what you want to say from the pulpit because you're worried about ramifications, you see that you are now no longer being faithful. You are captured by Constantinianism. Yep.
Would it likewise be Constantinianism to equate one political party with this is the Christian way of doing things?
Sure. This is also, you got people, Christians on the left, Christians on the right, who some line up with the Democratic Party and fight for justice and save the marshes and the swamps and the women's rights and all this kind of stuff. You got people who line up with the Republicans and fighting for their First Amendment rights for free speech and for protection of the unborn and for their guns, because that's a God-given right or something. And so it gets really strange. You have this kind of just people lining right up. And in fact, if you're following Christ, you're not going to line up with parties. You're not interested in that. What you're interested in is calling the left hand, calling the temporal realm to justice, and calling whoever is in authority to be more nearly just. Okay? Yes?
Thinking about our current environment and our particular candidates right now.
Oh, anybody thinking about this? Okay, go ahead.
It seems like I can't hold up either as a particularly just and noteworthy or good person.
Probably true.
Can I tell people to abstain, or is that wrong?
Well, you're living as a citizen in America, which means that you are part of the government, which means if you're going to uphold your responsibility in the temporal realm, what do you need to do? You need to participate, and voting is a key part of your participation. So I would be one of those who would absolutely say, if you fail to vote, you're violating God's will. And the word for that is? Citizen. Yes, it is. We've been down that road, so we don't need to hit that one again. So yeah, I would say if you don't vote, you're sinning. I believe that.
I just feel like if I vote one way or the other, I'm voting in favor of some kind of sin.
You need to sort this thing out. So you can go in and throw your vote away on a third party candidate, or even worse, write in somebody, You can do that. And then you can feel like I have a clear conscience. Or you can say, what does this country need and what do I need to do for it? And how can I best serve God's justice in this place? And you start sorting out what are the issues, what's important. And you start thinking things through. And yeah, I know there's lots of issues, and I know a lot of Christians really hate being single-issue voters. And my response to that is typically, well, the issues are not all the same. And saving marshes and, the greenhouse gases is one thing. That's important, and the creation is God's creation. But killing babies in the womb is kind of important too, and kind of a clear violation. And so I don't think all things are equal. frankly. So I have often said that it'd be great if we had a system where we could actually have the ability to debate about issues instead of having just one huge issue always skew the discussion, but it does. And as long as we're able to rip a kid out of a mother's womb and kill it, that's kind of a horrendous thing, and it should be stopped. So that's kind of how I look at it. Yep, Adam.
I heard once that we're all one-issue voters, we just have to find that issue. So if I were to say we should enslave every minority or put them to death, you would probably say, hey, that's an issue that...
it's kind of a big one issue.
Worth voting for.
Yeah, that's a big one issue. Yeah, I would agree. Right. Yeah. And see, this is kind of that's what you get with the Deutsche Christen, though. I mean, and we laugh at this, but that's exactly what was going on with the Third Reich, where you got saying Jews aren't citizens, and they're not really German. So we just got to get rid of them. That's what was going on. And you had the whole population more than willing to go with that, unfortunately, for all kinds of reasons. I know it's complicated, Versailles plays into this, everything. But that's exactly what's going on. So does the church have a responsibility? Yeah, it does. Absolutely it does. And should the church be rebuking the state when it's doing that stuff? Absolutely it should. Does that mean you might pay the price for your rebuke? Yeah. And see, this is where we get into the whole, wait a minute, what about my rights? What do you mean? We're talking about rights. This is the wrong way to talk. Christians don't have rights. You have privileges given to you by the state, but inherent rights, think about this. As a Christian, what rights can you claim before God? Yeah, I'm a sinner. Be merciful to me. That's your right. And so you have privileges, which are phenomenal, and take advantage of those. But you don't have rights. And so all this rights talk is just so enlightenment. It's not even the Christian way to talk. Missing the point. All right. Now, we only have a few minutes left, but there are several more things to talk about here. And I've got several, but anything else you guys want to hit at this point that you're thinking about as you contemplate this? All right. So now what about this 2004 document on guidelines for participation in civic events? Yeah, what about it? As CTCR documents go, this is one of them. This has to be, in my opinion, probably one of the worst ever done. It's just bad. And it cracks me up, because when was this written? It's written in 2004 is when it published. So why is this written? It's written because of the whole Yankee Stadium blast, okay? All the thing that came out of that. So you've got district president going to the Prayer for America, sponsored by Oprah, and everybody comes unglued. Some people say, hey, it's okay to pray, he did the right thing. Other people are saying, no, he's guilty of syncretism and unionism, and he's confusing the witness of the gospel, and this is wrong, he needs to repent, and everybody's all worked up. The media picks up on it. We look like fools because we're saying you shouldn't be praying for people, and we look like we're un-American, and people are embarrassed by that, and it just gets messier and messier and messier. So then, Synodical Convention's coming up in 2004. We got to get this settled before the convention. So the CTCR puts this thing on the fast track, and this is blazingly fast for a CTCR document, because from the time of the event till the time this came out, we're looking at about 2.5 years, which is like mind-blowing fast. CTCR is like 10 years for most documents. And so this is crazy fast, and it shows. So obviously, all the division in the Synod was represented on the CTCR, and you saw this when you read this. One paragraph, don't ever do that. The next paragraph, oh, you can do that. Well, then which one is it? Well, it might be a simple event, but maybe it's not. And it's hard to know. Which one is it? I don't know. And so, and I said this in my book, I made a little snide comment that the reader of this document can be forgiven if you read it hoping to get some clarity and puts it down with greater confusion than you started with. Because I think that's exactly the case here. It causes more confusion than anything. You get done with this, it's like, I'm more confused than ever. At least that's how it hits me. Maybe you're different. Maybe you thought it was awesome. Like, wow, I'm all set now. But I don't think so. My favorite part of this document, though, and this is just ripe with humor, is on page 4, the second paragraph. And this is just too delicious. So it has to be read out, even though it takes time. This is just too delicious. I just delight in this. The members of the CTCR are aware of certain events following September 11th, 2001, and decisions made about them. CTCR recognizes that the readers of this document are also aware of them. Yeah. CTCR in no way intends to render judgments about the decisions relating to these events, and so has attempted to avoid using language and terms in this document that would suggest that it has done so. Commission therefore asks the reader to receive this document on its own basis and not in the light of decisions made about these past events, which would be a misuse of this document, even though that's why the document was written. CTCR wishes to move beyond these events. Who didn't? And it offers these guidelines as a way of promoting unity and practice within our synod in the future. It just cracks me up. It's like there's a 3,000-pound purple elephant over there in the corner of the room. Don't look at it. We're not talking about that. It just cracks me up. It's so disingenuous. All right. Now, here's some interesting things, though, that I'm going to suggest to you. Let's broach this topic. When is it appropriate for a servant of the Word to go over into this realm and do some left-hand stuff? Is it? Yeah. Now, so we have to care for several things come into play here, though. We have to be careful of, in the light of our discussion about fellowship, we have to be very careful of two possibilities. One possibility is this thing called unionism. And what is unionism? That's when you give the impression that all Christians really believe the exact same thing and there's no difference. That's unionism. And the other danger is syncretism. And what's syncretism? That's when we give the impression that all religions are really all about the same thing. We're all worshiping the same God and there's no real difference. That's syncretism. Now, these are legitimate concerns. And every faithful pastor would say, I don't want to give the impression that what I teach is the same as what everybody else teaches, because that's watering down doctrine. That's the whole problem of not taking the doctrinal confession seriously. We covered that in the whole fellowship thing. So, when you have an invitation to come and participate in a civil event, you should be asking the question, who else is going to be participating? And if you're going to be sharing the dais with a Methodist and a Catholic and a Baptist, you need to say, wait, that probably is going to look like a unionistic thing because we're all going to look like we're all the same. It's probably not a good idea to do this. I shouldn't probably participate. By and large, that's kind of the rule, which is why when you have a joint service in your little town for Thanksgiving and all the clergy take turns doing it, trading their churches and doing different things, that does smack of unionism. It just does. And so that's one of those things we have to kind of politely say, yeah, I get it. We're all working together for common things when we can, but this is a common worship service, and it creates the impression that we're really all just the same, no difference, and that's not a good impression to give. That would be unionism. However, if you have an opportunity to go over here, and it turns out you're the only show, like you're going to dedicate a new flagpole down at the new city hall. And so they want you to come and do a prayer of dedication, and then they're going to have the band play from the high school, and a couple civic leaders are going to speak and give a speech or two, and then they're going to all have a big ice cream social afterwards. So can you do that? I would say yes. Go do that. Because you're not guilty of unionism, there's no problem with syncretism. Go do it. Go for it. Now, here's the interesting thing, though. So when you go there, what should you do? And here's where I'm going to give you my most controversial teaching ever in any class. And it's called the degree of revelation principle. Okay? The degree of revelation principle. And don't bother Googling it. I made it up.
It'll be on Wikipedia soon, I'm sure.
Well, you can post it. So, if you're a certified author, the degree of revelation principle works like this. Speak about God to the extent that He has made Himself known in the realm where you are. So you speak about God to the extent He has made Himself known in the realm where you're speaking. So if I go into the temporal realm and I'm speaking at a civil realm event, like the dedication of a new flagpole at my city hall in town, what do I need to say to these people? Has God made Himself known in this place? General revelation. People know He's there. They know they're accountable to Him. They know that they should be upholding justice. The conscience is at work. It's there. Am I going there to preach Jesus? I don't think so. I don't think so. In fact, I'm going there to remind them of what part of God's truth? The law. So I'm going to go there and I'm going to do that. So when I have my prayer, I might even frame it more like a little mini lecture in the form of a prayer. And I'll say something like, God, you've created this country and you've given us this place to live in. We're grateful for the many gifts. We're thankful for this new building that was built with taxpayer dollars, hopefully used appropriately. And we pray now that all business done in this place would be to your glory and to the good of your people, and that justice would prevail, and that those who seek to do otherwise would be rebuked and stopped, and may all that is done here honor you. We pray in your perfect name. Amen. So there's my prayer. So, was that a Christian prayer? I think it was. Did I explicitly mention Jesus? Nope. Was it Trinitarian? Not explicitly. I didn't say the words, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. So I didn't have to offend anybody. And what did I actually do? I pointed people to the law and to their accountability. Now, I would say that fulfills the degree of revelation principle. Now, this is why this is controversial, because you're told that you should be always ready to give an account of the gospel. And you say, I can't not talk of Jesus. I get that. And if you can't abide by the degree of revelation principle, fine. You know, you want to go and do Jesus everywhere you go, that's cool. I'm not going to knock that. How can I knock that? But you have to understand, I think there is room in thinking to say, another guy could actually do this and be quite faithful in doing that. And so what I'm kind of getting at is, there's this rule that floats around that says, if anybody says I can't talk about Jesus, then I can't accept. I don't think that's necessarily true. You can be creative about how you approach it, and you can speak God's truth in that context. And frankly, I've got Walther on my side on this. Because when Walther says, when you preach the law to unrepentant people, and when you start preaching the gospel, when they're repentant. So when I'm in the left-hand temporal realm, what do I assume about everybody over there? They're needing to repent. So what do you need to hear, law or gospel?
Law.
Yeah. Now the cool thing is this. My faithfulness over here does not slam the door on gospel proclamation. In fact, I'm giving a witness over here to God's truth, which might even incline somebody to say, I want to hear more about this dude who just told me what is. And I'll go check it out. What's that?
That's why you wear those little pins, the LCMS pins.
Yeah, your little LCMS pins, so everybody knows. It's in the flyer. You can hand out tracts to tell everybody where to find you. Or better yet, bottles of water with your logo stamped on them. Cool. So, that's the idea of the degree of revelation principle. I think it opens up some opportunities and some ways of considering this. So you see, you have to ask the question, what am I doing over here? I'm not here to proclaim the gospel. This is where people used to get on George W. Bush's back because, he's an evangelical, but he never talks about Jesus. Well, he shouldn't. He's leading the country. He should be promoting law and justice. That's his job. He's not there to evangelize the country. Not his call. And that's the confusion of things. So you're getting the idea here. All right, now, questions. Pushback, disagreement, concerns.
So whenever we have some ecumenism issues.
Ecumenical things, yes.
Ecumenical?
That's how I would say it. But you can say ecumenism if you want to.
That normally should be in the mood of repentance.
Well, not necessarily. But in some sense, yeah. See, ecumenical events are always kind of recognizing the brokenness, and we should be aware of that. And I'm not saying you have to run away from every one of them. There are appropriate times to have those kinds of conversations and those things. But yeah, the spirit is kind of like, we're not where we should be yet. So the celebration should be kind of muted. Now, this is also helpful too, because suppose I am in my little town of 2,200 in Podunk Corners somewhere in Midwest, and so we have a ministerial alliance. So can you go to the ministerial alliance? Yeah, participate? Yeah. So they decide, hey, we just caught wind they're trying to convert the old Sinclair gas station into a porn shop, and we don't think that's a good idea. We want to fight it. So can you get on board with that? Go for it. It's a left-hand thing. Go for it. Do whatever you can. And they say, we succeeded. Now let's have a big celebratory worship service. We're all going to get together at the Baptist church and celebrate. We want you to preach, Pastor, because you led the way. Now what do you say? Sorry, that's unionism. I'm not up for that. I'll fight the next time we have another thing, but we got to understand the distinction.
You say, we'll do it at my place.
Or we could say, we'll do it at my place and I run the whole thing. You're welcome to participate. You can do that too. Yeah. You're welcome to sit in the pews. That's what I meant. Yeah.
So in my little town, they have a Veterans Day
festival. Sure.
Thing.
Recognition.
It's basically done in the LCMS church. The pastor runs the whole show, and he just has people from the Ministerial Alliance read scripture verses as he does the prayers in between the verses.
Yeah, see, you're on the cusp there, because the reading the scripture is participating in some kind of a leadership role, and I get that, but that's kind of like the cusp. Now, a lot of these things you're going to be in kind of another ground kind of stuff. So you go back to Yankee Stadium. Was that good or bad? Well, that's one of those once-in-a-lifetime sorts of things. And we forget the situation. At the time, people thought we were starting holy wars, Christians against Muslims. And so, frankly, at that time, the country maybe needed to be reminded, we're not interested in a holy war. We can all get along. And so for somebody from the LCMS to be present probably wasn't necessarily a bad thing. But maybe it wasn't the right person who went. Ideally, maybe what you do is you send a military chaplain to go do that. Because military chaplains are always going to messy places and doing things that are kind of funny. But that's okay, he's a military chaplain. So ideally, you just send a high-ranking military chaplain and let him go there as your proxy. Then it comes off better. And then the other question is, what do you say when you're there? Well, see, I'm not there to preach a bunch of gospel. I'm there to remind people, yeah, things look pretty bad, but God's still in charge. And if you want to get your life figured out, you better figure out what he has to say to you. Amen. And you can say it a little more nicely and a little more eloquently, but that's the bottom line. But now, see another example of this is when the whole Sandy Hook thing happened. And you had that whole, it was a tragic, horrible thing. And you got an LCMS pastor who's got one of his own kids who was one of the victims of this thing. So now what? And that guy, I think, was exemplary. He did his very best not to give impressions of unionism, but he also thought it's really necessary for my people, my congregation, for me to be present at this event we're doing. And then Obama comes in and kind of co-opts the whole thing and announces he's going to show up. And so everything starts taking on a whole different feeling, and that pastor's concerned about this. So he tries to make sure there's a statement. We don't all agree on our positions on doctrine. That was said, and it was printed. So he's trying very hard to get things right. People still get offended. And so then what you do? I didn't mean to cause offense, and I'm sorry for that. I was doing the best that I thought I could. And there's the big lesson for all of us here. And this is the big takeaway is, when you're trying to sort this stuff out, it's not easy. You get into some tight spots sometimes, and you have to make a decision. And when you're the one making the decision, make it. But make it knowing what you're doing. Don't be an idiot and just say, oh, I always have to do Jesus, or I can never do anything that's going to make living you look dirty. You got to sort this stuff out, and it's going to get messy. And when you make your call, be ready to know why you did it and take responsibility for it. And if you're one of the guys looking at somebody else make a decision, and you don't like it, what do? Call him and talk to him. And if you will not call him and talk to him, what do? Shut the heck up. Don't say a word. Don't you blog a word. And don't give me this garbage, public sin needs public rebuke. If you're not going to talk to your brother about what he's done, shut up. Now, I could not be more adamant about that, guys. You don't have time to be blogging nonsense. Go take care of your sheep, for crying out loud. So, if you have a problem with another pastor, you talk to him. And if you don't have the guts or the desire to talk to him, don't say a word. You got nothing to stand on. Because he is a brother you should respect. And we need to give each other the benefit of the doubt here. When you see a brother making a tough call, you pray for him and you think, I'm glad he made the call. Maybe I would have done it differently, but he made his call. And I can stand with him on that. That's how we operate. And if you're really concerned about the call he made, then you find out why. And you give him the benefit of, tell me what you're thinking, what was going on, did you consider this? Were you using the degree of revelation principle? Okay, yeah, okay. Have the conversation. It'll all be good. All right, good. So I think I got everything covered I want to get covered. Kind of a short shrift, but it's all there. Any final thoughts? Okay, you've been duly chastened. Have a good day, guys. We'll see you on Thursday.